Well, I'm delighted to be able to say that we have on this program this morning a very popular person to be interviewed, who is the unconventional economist, Leith Van Onselen. Welcome, Leith.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me on again.
Oh, pleasure. Now, Leith, we were all interested to see that we're now within the band that the Reserve Bank requires concerning inflation. Is that right? And how did that happen?
Yes and no. So there's two inflation measures that matter, David. And the first one is the headline inflation. So that's basically your standard consumer price index. That's the thing that most people hear when they turn on the TV and radio, etc. And that did come in below the Reserve Bank's band. So we got the September quarter results were released on Wednesday, and we got a quarterly inflation print of 0.2%, which was below economists' expectations. And that was actually the lowest print we've had since mid-2020 during the pandemic. And annually, the inflation rate fell to 2.8%, which is within the Reserve Bank of Australia's target of between 2 and 3%. So that's obviously good news. And of course, you know, our esteemed Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, was out there crowing about it, saying that it's the lowest inflation in nearly 4 years, that it's now within target, et cetera, basically trying to, you know, pressure the Reserve Bank to low interest rates. Now, the thing about it though, David, is that it was a little bit statistically manipulated, shall I say, because the reason why the inflation fell, the primary reason was because the federal government has dished out a whole bunch of energy rebates. And, you know, you're seeing that in electricity bills, all that sort of thing. And what they did, that actually suppressed the quarterly inflation by 0.4%. So we basically had a big fall in energy prices. I think it's about 16% because of subsidies. And as a result, that pushed down the inflation rate. And we also had quite a sharp fall in petrol prices, which also pulled down the inflation rate. Now, the inflation, this brings me to the second reading from the inflation print, which is the core inflation or trimmed mean inflation. And that's what the Reserve Bank of Australia has said that they're going to focus on, because they want to basically exclude these volatile subsidies and things that are basically, you know, statistically manipulated. And what the trimmed mean inflation does is it basically chops out the most volatile items, and it looks at basically the 80% of other items in the band, and it looks at the price pressures in those areas. And what that showed is that quarterly inflation actually rose by 0.8%, the trimmed mean inflation in the September quarter, and was up 3.5% year on year. And both of those, in a quarterly sense and an annual sense, are above the Reserve Bank's target. And what that means is that the Reserve Bank is almost certain to remain on hold at its next meeting on Melbourne Cup Day, and will likely remain on hold at its December meeting, and that we're probably not going to get rate cuts until next year. Now, this leaves us in a pretty interesting situation, because the federal government is desperate for the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates, because it's got to head to an election by May next year. And so it's going to be putting the pressure on the Reserve Bank to cut. At the same time, the Reserve Bank is not willing to look at the headline measure. It wants to look at the underlying or core inflation measure, and that is still above its target. And Treasurer Jim Chalmers will no doubt point to the Reserve Bank Charter, which doesn't mention trimmed mean inflation. It only mentions headline inflation. That headline inflation must be within target, and he'll probably point to that and try and use that as a way to pressure the Reserve Bank. Whereas the Reserve Bank has been adamant and has said over and over again that the measure it looks at is the trimmed mean or underlying inflation. So we're set up for a bit of a argy-bargy and a stoush between the federal government, who is desperate for the Reserve Bank to cut rates, and the Reserve Bank, who wants to look at the underlying inflation as the core measure.
It would be unprofessional, would it not, to just look at what is really a fake inflation rate. And the government could give everybody money to buy bananas and fruit, and then say that fruit and bananas are now free in Australia, and therefore inflation has fallen. And that wouldn't be a real inflation rate, would it?
No. Look, it's certainly statistically manipulated. It's not just energy; it's also the rental subsidies. So they've handed out rental subsidies as well through the Commonwealth Rent Assistance Scheme. Look, it is artificially manipulated. I will say though that headline inflation does matter though, because the reason why it matters is because a lot of the government administered prices are actually set off headline inflation. So for example, by the government suppressing the headline inflation rate, it'll automatically mean that fuel excise won't rise by as much, tobacco excise won't rise by as much, pension payments won't rise by as much, the job seeker payments won't rise by as much, HEX indexation, all those sorts of things are all set at headline inflation. So by the government suppressing headline inflation, it does mean that other inflation in other areas will fall eventually, because those areas that are basically indexed to inflation won't rise by as much. But you won't see the impacts of that for several quarters, and certainly not in time for the next election. So, again, it's a situation where the government is desperate for the Reserve Bank to cut rates, because we're looking at a hung parliament at the moment, the way things stand, and Labor desperately needs the RBA to cut rates to save its political bacon. And that's why I think we're going to see a lot of pressure on the Reserve Bank to cut rates from Treasurer Chalmers, etc., because they need it to save their skin.
Meanwhile, you've been looking at immigration, which doesn't seem to be really falling under control, but there are a lot of noises coming out of the universities, aren't there, about maintaining immigration?
Yeah, that's right. So, basically, the immigration is falling a bit. So we had record migration last year of about 550,000. That's numbers we've never seen before. And to put that into perspective, the previous peak in immigration was the 2008-9 remember Kevin Rudd when he proclaimed that he wanted a big Australia? Well, immigration that year was about 315,000. Last year we got about 550,000. So it's off the charts. And it's still running as of mid this year, based on all the data that we've got to date. It was still running about 100,000 more than what the May federal budget predicted. So it's still running very hot. It is coming down slowly, but it's still running hot. And one of the areas where Labor's trying to basically slow immigration is trying to sort of put more restrictions on the higher education system, sector, through its caps on student numbers. It's done a few tightening measures there to try and stem the flow of students coming into Australia. And of course, that's led to massive pushback from the universities lobby, from vocational education providers. Basically, anybody in that space has pushed back hard, because they're trying to say that they're basically trying to argue that international education is a massive export, which is actually a bit statistically fudged. That it's key to the economy, that it's going to deprive Australia of workers and skills and all these sorts of things. But really, they're just talking their own book, and this is what they always do, because, obviously, if the government stems the flow of students into the country, well, then it obviously will hurt their bottom lines. Now, it's important to point out that the number of students Australia has is the highest in the world on a per capita basis. So our current student enrolments, according to the Department of Education, is about nearly 950,000, which is just massive. And if you look at the student visa numbers, roughly 1 in 30 people in Australia currently are on either a student visa or a graduate visa.
That's extraordinary.
So it is extraordinary numbers, and the growth has been absolutely extreme. So just to put that into perspective, in 2019, which was the former peak before the pandemic, we had 806,000 international students in Australia. As of July this year, we had 944,000 in Australia. So it's increased a lot.
Do you see a good result if Peter Dutton gets in and goes ahead with his 25% reduction? Was that not enough?
Yeah, no, I think it should definitely be more, but certainly, look, I take any reductions good, and look, the Peter Dutton's reduction has been to the permanent migrant intake. So the permanent migrant intake currently is set at 185,000 plus another 20,000 in humanitarians. So it's effectively, 215,000 if you count this humanitarian intake. Now, Peter Dutton has promised to reduce the permanent migrant intake from 185,000 down to about 140,000 for a couple of years. I'm not sure what he wants to do with humanitarians, but so look, it's a decent cut. Now, the bigger issue is he also needs to get down net overseas migration, which is permanents plus temporaries, the flow of permanents plus temporaries. And obviously, one of the areas where we've had a massive increase since the pandemic, since the 2019, has been the temporary visas. So Australia currently has around 500,000 more temporary migrants in the country, and this isn't including visitors. This is everything bar visitors, than we had in 2019 before the pandemic. So Labor has said, like before they got elected, they said that Australia has too much temporary migration, etc. They need to clamp down on it. But instead, temporary migration's actually gone up by about 500,000 since Labor came in.
Is for all those targeted immigrants, I must say, I'm still not seeing any Irish boys. There used to be lots of Irish boys coming in who were working on buildings in Sydney, and there seem to be hardly any of them these days.
No, it's pretty much...
Mainly people driving Ubers.
That's it. It's pretty much been driven by South Asia. So, India and, Nepal, etc., are the fastest growing areas, those temporary migrants. So China is our single biggest because through the student route, but India and Nepal have been catching up very quickly, and India is currently our second biggest and Nepal's our third. And that our entire migration system has basically pivoted, that way towards Asia, obviously. And the explosion in temporary migrants is absolutely off the chart. So in 2008, just to put into perspective, we had 1 million temporary visa holders in Australia. Currently, we have 2.4 million. So that is a huge increase. And obviously, look, it certainly increased a lot under the former government. It went from 1 million in 2008 when Labor were in to 1.9 million at the end of the coalition's term, or just before the pandemic. And it's currently at 2.4 million. So it's gone up 500,000 since our stock of temporary migration is 500,000 higher now with Labor than it was in 2019 under the coalition before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, it crashed, obviously. It turned, fell quite sharply, but it's rebounded massively in the last few years under Labor. And we've never had this much temporary migration in Australia.
And the politicians seem to all believe, including state governments, that all of these people should live in the three eastern capitals. And this seems to be particularly the views of the New South Wales and Victorian governments. And I think you've been quite scathing, have you not, about a plan by the Victorian government in relation to high rise in Melbourne?
Yeah, that's right. Look, it is kind of crazy when you think about it that the two states that bear the most burden from immigration, which is New South Wales and Victoria, their governments are somehow supportive of this. Because, as I've said repeatedly, the federal government gets most of the gains from immigration. So, they collect 80% of the tax revenue. The states and local governments collect about 20%. And as a result, the federal government loves big Australia immigration because it gets more company taxes, personal taxes, etc. But the cost of that immigration then falls on the states. And yet we have Victoria and New South Wales drowning in debt, always frantically trying to build more infrastructure, selling off all their assets. I mean, privatisations have been massive in the last 20 years, selling off their assets to then try and fund new infrastructure to try and build out for the new migrants, etc. Both states are drowning in debt, and yet both their governments seem to be supportive of this huge immigration, which just to me does not make any sense. They should be pushing back hard. And the latest salvo in this is both governments are now pushing for high-rise shoeboxes to accommodate all these migrants. So, Victoria's just launched their 50 activity centre scheme, which basically wants to set 20 sort of inner and middle ring suburbs of Melbourne to be plastered in high-rise apartments of 20 stories, up to 20 stories. New South Wales has done exactly the same thing. The New South Wales Productivity Commission said that, building rules should be deregulated and, we should get rid of height limits, apartment size limits, requirements to have parking, storage, natural light, all these sorts of things. And this is all a bid to try and basically increase the number of apartments being built in both cities to accommodate this mass immigration, when I would argue that instead of doing this, we should just cut the immigration because we don't want this future. I don't know anybody who thinks it's a good idea for Sydney and Melbourne to double in size or roughly double in size over the next 40 to 50 years from where they are now, and for future residents to have to live in high-rises which are often very poorly built, as we've seen, with all the apartments that have been built over the last 10 years.
Yes. And surrounded by limited infrastructure in terms of roads, for example. in terms of water and in terms of schools and hospitals. All of these will have to grow, and they can't grow.
And there just isn't enough labour to provide all this stuff. So the latest tausch that's broken out in New South Wales, David, is this. Several groups have argued. So we've had basically the Productivity Commission, Treasurer Daniel Mookie, and Mervac have all argued that the state's spending too much money on infrastructure, and that's diverting resources and labour away from building homes. But then you had the committee for Sydney last week then argue that no, we need more infrastructure investment, because if you don't have the infrastructure investment, you can't build the homes. And the committee for Sydney argued that Sydney needs it was some astronomical dozens and dozens more train and tram lines along Sydney, which is going to cost how many hundreds of billions of dollars to do this stuff. Well, and this just shows you can't have both. You can't have high population growth, high infrastructure, and high housing. It doesn't work.
Well, you'll be delighted to know that the great activity of the New South Wales Parliament recently was to allow men to change their sex by statutory declaration and thereby engage in women's sports and go into women's spaces, no doubt. That seemed to be the principal activity of our politicians. Yeah,
look, it's all distractions. So, I mean, I've said it previously, the lion's share of Australians don't care about this sort of stuff, right? They don't care about all this, these culture wars and, someone's sexuality and what. No one cares. I mean, sorry, some people care, but most people don't care. What we care about is we care about good governance. We want to have a good standard of living. We want to have, efficiently provided services and infrastructure and all those sorts of things. Because if we're all paying tax, we want it to be spent properly.
Yes.
We don't want to be spent on bloated departments doing all this, DEI, diversity and blah, 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 and all this other stuff that and the problem with it is, David, it seems to have infected all areas of government. So even local government now, which really should just be concerned about, basic infrastructure provision, garbage collection, all the nuts and bolts stuff that a local government does. Instead, they've now got departments doing diversity and, Indigenous rights and all this other stuff, which really isn't their purview. But this is sort of a thing that's going across all the levels of government now. And really, I'd argue that all levels of government need to get back to just, the nuts and bolts of what their key purpose is. And for states and local governments, that is infrastructure provision, service delivery, and doing those things most, as efficiently and cost effective as possible. Well, and providing taxpayers value.
Yes. I can remember about 20 years ago in my municipality, which includes Bondi, everywhere signs suddenly appeared about 20 years ago declaring Waverley a nuclear-free municipality, as if anybody was going to build a nuclear station in Waverley.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, and I bet you bottom dollar, David, there's probably a whole dozen people employed in that area, which ratepayers are paying for to pay for that stuff. And we've just created these huge bureaucracies at all levels of government, which is just wasting taxpayers' fund, wasting resources, focusing on stuff which really these governments should not be involved in. A classic example in Victoria was we had the Victorian government signed the China Belt and Road Initiative, which that is a federal issue. So why is the state government getting involved in that sort of stuff? And why are local governments having departments looking at climate change and net zero and DEI, diversity and equality, inclusion, all this sort of stuff, running, LBTG, whatever days and this sort of stuff. Like all this stuff is beyond what their purpose should be. And I want to see governments get back to their core purpose of providing value for taxpayers, providing infrastructure services as efficiently and cost effectively as possible.
I think you're so right. We'll have to finish on that point, but I just might mention that in the recent New South Wales local government elections, in my municipality, which happened to be one of those where the Liberal Party remembered to put in their nominations on time, the Liberal candidates were all preaching as to how they were going to observe net zero in the municipality. And I cannot see how they possibly could. But thank you so much. You always bring us great truths in relation to matters economic, political, please continue doing that, because it is so important that the people be informed as to the economic truth. Thank you, Leith.
Thanks, David. Speak to you next time.
Good.